So thank you very much to the organizers, Laura and Simon and Vittorio, for this invitation to be here at the Bubbles conference. It's a really, really important and interesting topic that you have selected and an amazing group of speakers. And that kind of interaction between the art pieces and the research seems to be what the world needs right now. We need to explore those different ways that we might address and open up questions that are at the same time about knowledge making and are existential and are about figuring out how to navigate the world. It's also a great pleasure to talk after Vittorio Gallese. Some of the things I will be saying kind of follows from some of his basic models, but we can return to that during the discussion. I come from Aarhus University in Denmark. Should I move? Yeah. I come from Aarhus University in Denmark from something called the Interacting Minds Center. And as the title of the center suggests, we are very much interested in what happens when people do things together. We're interested in what happens in their bodies, in their brains, in their minds, and how that helps us basically to shape the kind of world that we are living in. And the task I was given today was to try to illustrate various aspects of that interacting with the world. And I'll try to do that by putting it into also a bit of a historical or maybe even an evolutionary framework. So this is Colin Renfrew. He is a professor emeritus in archaeology at Cambridge University. And he has formulated something called the sapient paradox. And the sapient paradox is that if you look at kind of the biology of our species, then it seems as if the biology of our species really has been in place for quite some time, 60,000 years, maybe 200,000 years. But in ways that we don't quite understand, we can see that the cultural world that we live in really seems to have taken off much, much later. And this sapient paradox tries to address, well, what is it actually about our way of being in the world that has changed so dramatically? If it's not in our fundamental biology, what is it then? And one of the ways that one might explore that is that it might have to do with new ways and novel ways of interacting both with each other, with the world, and with the technology that are really shaping the kind of worlds we are and the people we are in. And I'm going to start this story here at some of what some might see as the pinnacle of human evolution, at least if we ask the sitting American president. This is a golf course, but it's not just any golf course. The golf course is located on the southern tip of South Africa, in a place called Pinnacle Point of everything. We have Cape Town over to the left. And if you look out over the sea, if you could see land, the next place would be Antarctica. There are huge whales swimming around in front of it. And on top of this pit here is this amazing golf course. But we're not here for the golf course, but for the caves that are found just underneath the golf course. And in these caves here have been found what seems to be some of the earliest findings of what we would attribute to contemporary human culture. So it's not just a matter of finding stone flakes. People have also discovered that they used ochre as a coloring device. They used fire as a technology. Some of the stone tools seem to have been hardened in the fire. And there are also examples of seashells being collected for what seems to be ornamental purposes. So these findings here are kind of moving the story about human culture as we know it back to Africa. It didn't seem to happen in Europe with the Neanderthal or with the Cro-Magnons any longer. And it also moves it a lot further back in town. And I start here because last year we went here on an expedition or a tour together with a group of archaeologists. And this is the view here from one of the caves looking out over the sea. And here are some of the things that has been found here. You can see ochre, tools that have been made, etc. The findings themselves were interesting, but I guess what was most amazing was this sense here, this kind of strange sense of awe that we all felt. This is Christian and Carsten, two of my colleagues, kind of sitting inside that cave and getting that sense that it could almost have been us who sat there 60,000, 160,000 years ago. And I'm going to return to that again later, this kind of strange ability to, so to say, imagine yourself extended through a time that goes back many generations and into other species again, that we felt very kind of strongly there. So let's leave that story as a particular human capacity to feel yourself extended in space and in time, as we go into what it is that we might be interacting with. And the first couple of studies I'll describe are really about some of our work in trying to understand, well, if we interact with the body and with each other, what might be going on under those circumstances? The first study I'll kind of talk you through is, we almost call it the atom of interaction. It's becoming very popular in cognitive psychology to think of organisms as entities that are caught up in an action cycle with the world. It's about acting in the world, and it's about seeing your actions, the effect it has on the world, and how that shapes the perceptions that you're caught within. And one can think of the simplest possible model of interaction of two people as being one instance where one person's actions become the other person's perceptions, and the other person's actions becomes the first person's perceptions. And in this particular study here, we try to do this as a really simple finger tapping experiment. The task was a simple one. People were basically placed in a room, they were given headphones on, and in the headphones they would hear a rhythm. And then they were told that the task was to keep the rhythm after the initial beats and then synchronize with what they heard in their ears. It's a really, really simple task. But in this particular instance, you could hear two different things in your earphones. You could either hear yourself, and in that case it's just a matter of keeping the pulse, or you could hear another person. And out of this, you get kind of a somewhat complicated 2x2 design, because if both people hear themselves, in a sense, they live in a bubble. They go on unconnected to each other. If B hears herself and A hears the other, then A has to follow after B. There is the other situation down here. And what we were effectively interested in was the bidirectional coupling situation. So this is a situation where I hear you and you hear me, and we both have to try to coordinate with each other. And remember, the task is as simple as possible, just keep the rhythm. Now, what happens under those circumstances? I'll talk you through the figure. It's not as complicated as it looks. Up here in red and blue are the inter-tap intervals of a person. And if the inter-tap interval becomes shorter, it basically means that the person is speeding up, right? It becomes faster and faster. And as you can see in this situation, the uncoupled situation, basically blue speeds up, red more or less keeps the pulse, but there is no interaction between them. In this next situation here, we can see that red is kind of overshooting and undershooting and overshooting and undershooting. So this is a situation where red follows blue and basically all the time has to try to keep up with what the other person is doing, and the other person is just caught up in their own bubble. This is a way to look at these things here. It's called a windowed cross correlation of, no, sorry, it's not. It's a windowed cross correlation of tap intervals. Lax 0 is blue, meaning a negative correlation. And that just means that I have no way of doing what you do in the very moment. Like -1 is positive, and that means that if I follow you, I can basically try to be as fast as you were on the previous move. But since you might be changing over time, I'll always be out of sync with you. Up here is the opposite situation. Now blue is trying to track red. And then we have here what was the interesting situation, namely the one where A hears B and B hears A. And just looking at the inter-tap intervals, you see kind of a very interesting overshooting, undershooting, overshooting, undershooting. And if we look at these correlations, we can see none of them are in sync with each other, but they're always in sync with what the other person did on the previous trials. Now, what does that translate into? This translates into, you can say, a certain model of interaction, where in a sense, if you were faster than me the last time, then I'll speed up the next time. But on the contrary, you will be slowing down because I was slower than you. And therefore, we are caught up in a system where none of us are in sync with each other, but actually over time, we keep the pulse very, very stable. And it turned out that in this particular situation, which might be one of, you can say, each person trying to predict at a very fast motor level the other person, you get a stable interaction that keeps the pulse more or less in place. It was as stable as interacting with a metronome when we looked at the patterns in themselves in them. But none of the people are really in sync with each other. Everyone seems to be caught up in a hyper-following game of trying to interpret what the other is doing next, and thereby producing a situation for the other to be in. And that might be almost a classical case of what a lot of interaction is about. And we can see that our motor systems are geared to work with this very quickly. This next study here tries to look at another instance of people falling into particular rhythms with each other. a little bit like Vittorio was doing in his talk, we were also going back to Durkheim, one of the founders of French sociology. And as you heard from Vittorio's talk, Durkheim was very much interested in what happens as people enter into some kind of social actions, and how does that differ from being just on your own in an individual action. And one of the more wild speculative ideas that Durkheim had was that he talked about collective effervescence. This was the time where electricity came about, and the idea was that when people do collective actions together, it is as if effervescence, like some kind of an electricity, some kind of a source of coordination, can spread inside of a crowd. Now, we were interested in seeing whether something like that could be seen to have any kind of a biological marker. And in order to do that, my colleague Dimitris Sigalatas, who is an anthropologist that studies firewalking rituals around the world, he took a group of people to a ritual in northern Spain, central Spain, where people on the longest day of the year, everyone in the village gets together, make a huge fire, and as the fire burns down and leaves a set of coals on the ground, some of the people from the village will be walking on these burning coals here, while they often carry some of their relatives on their shoulder. And in the meantime, the rest of the village are just standing around and screaming and shouting and partying and whatever you do. Now, what we were interested in this particular instance was to see this as a case of social coordination. Here are people that do highly emotional things with each other and with themselves. And what we have up here in red is the pulse of a firewalker. And he has to walk on fire at this particular time here. And maybe not surprising, immediately prior to his firewalk, the pulse just goes up to 180, something like that. Then he walks on fire, and then the pulse goes down again. I guess this is not surprising if you were to walk on fire. But the interesting trace is the one below it, because this is his wife. And she's not going to do any kind of firewalk. She just watches her husband go on fire. And in very interesting ways, we can see that there seems to be like a sharing of bodily states expressed very crudely by what goes on in terms of the heart rhythm. So in other words, it is as if these, you can say, ability to be in the moment and be in the experience isn't caught up only to the person who does the exercise, but is also connected to seeing someone that you know who does it. And at this particular point in time here, we see high peaks in the pulse. Again, none of them does a firewalk, but another one of their relatives are doing the walk. So irrespective if you have been doing the walk as the man or been watching as a woman, we see a particular pattern here. And once we started to look into these things more systematically, using a complicated way of plotting pulses against each other and trying to identify where would the bodies fall into kind of patterns of complexity that would be similar, one could, from the time series, which is found along the diagonal here, basically in a firewalker tell when the ritual would start and when they would be walking on fire. A similar thing could be seen in a related spectator, so the wife or the parent or whatever that was of it. We could see the same structures of the rituals enacted in their bodies. Whereas the non-related spectator, you can call it the tourist in town, in a sense didn't produce any kind of systematic patterns in how the bodies were evoked. So just to say that what we might see as cultural practices, in this instance a ritual, seems to produce a little bit like Durkheim was saying, effects in the body that are not only limited to the person doing it, but the main difference was really whether you were a member of the group or not a member of the group here. And this is not to say that it is a heart rate that drives these kind of differences, but this is just kind of a proxy for some kind of biological processes that might be ongoing. We can call it an informational coupling. It could be explained by some of the mirror mechanisms that Vittorio was alluding to before. But again, suggesting that, in a sense, once we are inside of these social spaces here, it's not just our minds, it's also our bodies who are open to the experiences of others, at least once we know them. So, one thing that certainly seems to be interacting from some of these studies is a sensitivity to our bodies to be reacting to what goes on in other people's bodies when we are bound in interactions with them, either through emotional relationships or joint actions tied up to each other. Obviously, the optimally interacting mind center is also interested in what might be going on in minds that does something to each other and how that might be working up. And the next study I'll give you is kind of another case of a coupling that occurs. It was a task developed by Bahadur Barami, an Iranian postdoc with us, who was given the challenge to try to come up with a very robust and systematic task that would allow two people to solve the task better, hopefully together, than each of them would do on their own, and in such a way that we could try to understand what went on in it. And what he came up with was a really, really boring kind of discrimination task, visual discrimination task. Imagine that you sit in front of a computer and first you see this screen rapidly and then you see this screen rapidly, and then you're given the task to say which of these images contained an error. And you might be able to see that in the first image, one of these Gabor patches had a slightly different contrast. The things are presented really fast. It's a difficult task. You have to make a choice. People can do it better than chance. The task in this situation was that two people were sitting next to each other as they did the task. And if they disagreed about whether it was the first or the second image that contained the mistake, they could talk to as long as they wanted to each other until they came up with a solution. And subsequently, they were told of the result. Now, because this is such a boring task, then people studying visual psychophysics, how people can do signal detection, have mapped out the mathematics of it. And you can basically plot, the success of these things here in particular graphs, where the steepness of the graphs indicate how well you are at discriminating. And in red is one participant, in blue is another participant. The black one was significantly steeper across these different settings here. So in a sense, there was a situation where people were able to do it better jointly than they could on their own. There were different ways of playing with the system, and one of the things that Bahadur did was he introduced noise into it. So in other words, he had one of the participants have images that were more difficult to discriminate. And based on various mathematical models that allowed to, so to say, tell the difference between different ways that people might make a shared decision. You could think of people making a shared decision randomly by just flipping a coin. You could think of them doing it by the way that they somehow identify who is the best person to do the task, and they always go with the best person. One could think of also a situation where in ways that we don't understand, there is like a telepathic connection from one brain to another brain, so that these things somewhere in quantum space becomes integrated into a joint decision. Or finally, one could think of a model which is that people do what's technically called weighted confidence sharing. And what that basically means is just that when you talk to each other about these things here, you share not just what you think, but also how certain you are about what you think. Right? So I might say, well, I didn't know what it was, I had to make a choice, and my partner says, well, I'm pretty sure it was the first one. And then you would probably go with the partner instead. It turns out that these different forms of communication behave differently under these systems here. And by just looking at the experiment, it seemed as if what people were doing was to exchange misunderstandings with each other or uncertainty with each other. Now, one of the beauties in working in an interdisciplinary center is that people can pick up on these ideas. And we had someone working in our group who were trained in linguistics and semiotics. And they thought, well, what actually happens when people solve a task like this? So they went out and transcribed all the interviews of people talking about, was it the first or the second? And that might be things like, we take yours because I saw nothing. I didn't see anything. I took a bet. Already here we can see that people have many ways of talking about uncertainty. It might be seeing, it might be betting, it might be sensing. There are all sorts of different languages with it. And what this allowed to do was to try to look at this systematically and see, does it matter for this task here that people develop a shared language? So if I talk about my uncertainty as seeing, and you talk about it as seeing in the same round, we have used the same words to describe it. And lo and behold, it turned out that the more what's called local linguistic alignment you might see, in other words, the more people would agree on the same word within a trial, the better they became at solving the task. And also, the more they over time agreed on that when we talk about our uncertainty, we use one particular word amongst us, the better they became at solving the task. So here is an instance where you can see that the aspects of interaction that seems to be ongoing here is somehow mediated by, and the success of it is mediated by an ability to create a shared language. And in other experiments, it was shown also that as people started to develop this kind of shared language, it also fed back on them becoming better and actually solving the task in the first place as well here. So in interesting ways, it seems that one of the ways our minds might be interacting with each other is precisely by creating these shared languages of uncertainty that allows us to act in a world that is uncertain and cannot be known. Now, one of the interesting things that you have been exploring here at the Bubbles conference and the whole Bubbles workshop are these questions about, well, what goes on then in situations where what I'm interacting with is myself, and what might be going on in situations where what I might be acting with is the other, and how do these things shape into each other? And of course, as with many other kind of interesting and important questions, that has been investigated in interesting ways also inside behavioral sciences and neurosciences recently. And a couple of years ago, I came across a paper that really puzzled my mind. It was done by a number of Chinese researchers. And what they were interested in was to see if there were different understandings of what it is like to be a self if you compare Chinese research, Chinese people and Western people. They wanted to see if kind of ideas about being in a collective setting, as we believe Chinese are, would somehow affect the way that the brains were processing it. And in order to look at this, they built on a somewhat strange psychological theory, kind of cross-cultural psychology, that has been going with the ideas that there is a strong difference between Westerners on one hand, that according to the theory tend to view the self as an autonomous entity, you separate from others, you behave according to your own internal attributes. And in contrast, this theory says East Asians, they emphasize what it is like to connect to others, what it is to be part of a group, and that creates an interdependent self. And these researchers, in ways that we will come back to, had, in a sense, tried to see, can we find the independent and the interdependent self in the brain? Now I'm going to go out a little bit of an excursus into what it is like to do cognitive psychology or cognitive experimentation, because you can ask the question, how on earth would you find the self in the brain? Now it turned out that people had found a way of doing that previously that can be debatable, but it had been studied. And the idea was basically that inside a brain scanner you would see a picture of yourself, and this is a somewhat younger version of myself. And then you would see a picture of a famous person that you didn't know. And then you would see these words like dependable, polite, daring, talkative, and you should try to evaluate if these words related to yourself or related to this famous other person. Self, other, the idea would then be that if there are some areas that light up and are more powerful when you relate to yourself as opposed to relating these words to the others, then that might be where the self is located in the brain. And one of the areas that people keeps finding here is an area in the front of the brain, in the anterior cingulate, an area in medial prefrontal cortex, so kind of here in the middle of the front of the brain. We can go on a lot and discuss about whether this is really getting at the self in the brain. It's an interesting paradigm that was first about memory, that people remember words better if they relate to themselves. But it's just to say that with a question mark in front of it, a number of studies had come out, like finding the self, that suggested that here is a way for us to find the self. And my good Chinese colleagues, they said, well, if there is a way to find the self, then we could also use this to tell the difference between what it is like to be a self in China and to be a self in the US. So they basically took a group of students in China, American students and Chinese students, let them look at pictures of themselves or pictures of former American president or former Chinese president, and then do this kind of exercise. And then they also introduced a third condition, which was to say, well, if it's about being interdependent, then we want to see how do people relate to their mother as opposed to themselves or to the former president. Okay? So kind of a clever trick to take the old paradigm and just add something to it. And lo and behold, what we found was that in the Chinese and the Westerners, there were these parts of the brain here in the front, medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, that so to say lit up both when there were more activity when Chinese and when Westerners saw the difference between themselves and their president. But the interesting contrast was down here, Because when the Westerners looked at the difference between the self and the mother, these regions again lit up, whereas in the Chinese there seems to be no difference whatsoever. In other words, the self and the mother, according to this study, is placed in the same place among Chinese brains. And this, the authors claim that these notions about the independence and the interdependence, they're not just cultural constructs, they are really in the brains of these people here, because the Chinese brains tell no difference behind it. Now, I kind of have a dual training in anthropology and neurobiology, and the anthropologist in me was really interested at this attempt, so to say, to use a technology to try to tell a story about who you are and who you are not. Because if we try to look at what goes on in these situations here, we could say, well, what it basically relates is a number of studies of brains that you look at, and then you contrast that with a huge imagined community of 1.5 billion Chinese, and you take another set of brains that you look at, 20 American students, and you relate them to an imagined community of maybe 800 people living in the West. And what you basically show is that, since those brains are radically different from each other, of course, the communities also tend to be different from each other. So here, one could argue, is almost a neurological proof that we live in a cultural bubble that's biologically based, and if I'm Chinese, myself and my mother is the same, and if I'm a Westerner, they're different to each other. I thought that was a bit of a dubious story for various reasons, but I thought, how do you do that? How do you do it? So I basically went to Beijing and met up with Shihui Han, the first author, and the senior author on the study, and said, well, let's explore this a little bit further. And he brought himself and a PhD student to Denmark, and we tried to see, could we replicate the study in a more systematic kind of way? We did another version of the cultural self-study, and this time he had read some William James, so we said, well, maybe the self consists of several different things. We could have a physical self, dealing with the body, we could have a mental self, dealing with our states, and a social self that has to do with what kind of a role would you like to be. And they were also implemented in a trait adjective ascription task. And the examples would be of a social role would be you could be Asian, poor, a fan, a landlord, etc. Mental traits could be about are you decent, tolerant, assertive, confident, lazy. Those were the classical things. And physical traits would be about what does your body look like. So this was, in a sense, taking the same paradigm, but twisting it a little bit and asking the question, do we still find different cells in the brain? And then doing it in a somewhat larger study. This is stuck here. Yeah. And the first thing we found was, well, it really depended on what kind of questions we asked. If we asked about social, mental, or physical questions, what kind of the brain that lit up. So, the self didn't seem to be like in one particular part of the brain here. But also, quite interestingly, we found that looking at the social aspects of the brain, well, we did see some contrast between the Chinese and the Danes. The Danes had a stronger difference in the middle frontal part of the brain. The Chinese had a stronger difference in the back of the brain between relating to self and to others, if it was inside a social domain. But once we looked further into the data, we could see that relating it to some kind of a measure of independence, a way of asking questions about how independent you see yourself, it turned out that the relations were actually very similar among the Chinese group and among the Danish group here. So, in other words, instead of seeing radical differences between Chinese and Danish young students, what we saw was that both for Chinese and for Danish students, you can be in a particular place in this spectrum of ways you might relate to yourself and to others. And for the Chinese and for the Danes, that seems to translate into somewhat similar patterns of brain activity among them. So rather than seeing Chinese live in a bubble and Danes live in a bubble, it was like, well, it's kind of the same bubble that we live within, but the way that we find ourselves within those bubbles might be slightly different depending on the situation. So it became, in a sense, you can say a story of similarities, differences, and mechanisms, both within and between groups. And what we kind of shifted the discussion away from was to say it's not just a matter of the Chinese are in one bubble, the Danes are in another. It's really about saying the categories and concepts that we front load into the studies need to be studied carefully along those situations here. So now we have been interacting with ourselves, we have been interacting with others, we have been interacting with minds, we have been interacting with bodies. But there is something that's very characteristic with the type of stuff that humans do more dramatically than probably any other species we know of, and that has to do with how it is that we interact with the material. We saw also in Vittorio's speech from Simononden's analysis this kind of very striking finding that there seems to be something in the way in which material objects and technologies becomes not so much different from ourselves, but an extension of who we are and what we might be doing. And the next couple of studies that I would like to explore with you are trying to say, well, can we see any kind of traces in the brains or in the bodies of that kind of aspect of interacting, not just with each other, like when you fall in sync or when you walk on fire together, but you interact with each other around doing something together in the world. So in this particular experiment here, we went along an idea. We basically took our Prime Minister's inaugural speech at a September opening of the Parliament, and then we mapped out all of those words that no one really knows what means, but that political speeches are full of. And then we asked people to come into the lab, and we gave them some Lego bricks, and we said to them, here are these words, could you try to build them in Lego? And you can do it either alone or you can do it in a group. And these are some instances of it here, people building collaboration or justice or responsibility or knowledge, etc. So very simple task, building these things. While they were building it, we were looking at how their bodies changed, how they fell into sync. And as they built these stuff here, their various rhythms became more or less coordinated with each other. I won't focus on that now here. But what we did the next day was we brought them back into the lab, and we took them down to the basement into a brain scanner and asked them to see some of these images here, and then ask the question, what happens when you look at these pictures? Those could be things that you had done yourself, it could be things that others have done, it could be things that had involved one person or several other persons. And the main contrast, we asked them two types of questions. We both asked them about how stable is this particular object, but we also asked them about how much would this particular object fit with the description that it had. It turns out if you just look at an object and say if it's stable, then it doesn't make a difference to the brain, at least in our study, whether you have done it yourself or if other people have done it. But once you tie it into how well does it fit the meaning of it, we found some quite interesting differences here. So in asking about questions and looking at where they had participated as opposed to where they had not participated, we saw kind of areas in the medial prefrontal part of the brain, in the paracingulate and also in the superior temporal sulcus, areas that some people would associate with what's called the default mode network. Other people would see it as typical signs of kind of a social interaction in it. These are not areas that you would typically associate with object perception or with processing of objects. So in other words, it was as if seeing the objects themselves really brought about a story that seems to be much more about self and other and interaction and the history of the thing here. And when we asked the question about, well, we had asked in the previous day, how well did you feel that you collaborated with the other members in the group? It turned out that a particular region here in the insula on the left side of the brain correlated with people's experience of how well had the collaboration been experienced. So in other words, we see that these objects, when seen again here, seems to be seen not just as objects, but also carriers of the history that has gone into producing them. In other words, they have become, to the brain, sort of social objects here. But of course, we know that you can say the social world isn't just a world of collaboration and working nice and neatly together. So we tried in a second experiment to play a little bit with how would these objects be changed by the particular way that you had interactions about it. Again, we brought our kit of Lego bricks here. We asked people to build together with each other some cars that should look really cool, and they should be able to travel down a ramp in particular ways. And while we did it, we looked at how they were coordinating their hands with each other. We looked at their pulse, how the heart rates were coordinating with each other. And at that time, we thought that we would be seeing that the more people collaborated with each other, the more they would fall in sync with each other, because this was what the literature seems to be very much about. And in this particular situation, we asked people to build together in different ways. One of the situations was, you can call it egalitarian. They should basically just build together jointly, playfully. And the other situation, we assigned a boss, and the boss could tell the other person, now you take that brick and you put it in, and now you take that brick and you put it in. And then there was a turn-taking condition where you just, one after each other, would put in a brick. This is a complicated slide that tries to summarize across the egalitarian condition, the hierarchical condition, and the turn-taking conditions, where we would find positive relations between results of the building activity and measures of heart coordination and hand coordination. And here are the subjective perceptions, so how fun was it, how much did it feel like collaboration, how difficult was it, how effortful was it, etc. How beautiful were the cars and how far did they travel. And the interesting finding is that most of this is either non-existing, showing no correlation, or it's red. So in other words, across these particular studies here, it seems that, well, to build a big car that's also beautiful, people should really not coordinate with each other. They should not fall in sync with each other in terms of how their movements were going and in terms of how their heart rates were going. It was only consistent that if it had felt like a difficult task for them to do, then their hands and bodies came to fall into sync with each other. And then there is this kind of really interesting situation here, which is that if you're in a hierarchical situation, if you have a boss, follower, then it feels more like collaboration if you synchronize with your boss or if your employer synchronizes with you, but it really doesn't do anything good for the type of outcome that might come of it. We have tried to tell our university leadership that they should think about that when they run a department, etc., but I'm not sure they have listened. So this particular story here, you can say, tells a slightly more complicated story about what it is like to be falling into interactions with each other when the task isn't just about, so to say, mirroring each other's emotions, but it's also about producing something in the world. And one of the ways that we are currently trying to interpret this is to say, well, synchrony might be good in order to stabilize kind of an emotional situation with each other, but it's about solving things together. Then synchrony might be an instance of people actually not being able to do task difference, not being able to solve something, not being able to, so to say, carve out a solution space between them. Now this brings us in an interesting way back again to the first slide. So what is it we also interact with in terms of plots, stories, and narratives? The American-Canadian psychologist Merlin Donald came up with a couple of years ago a theory about what seems to characterize human life, and he called the term the slow process, a hypothetical cognitive adaptation for distributed cognitive networks. And in this particular theoretical article, he argues that there seems to be something in human life which isn't really about remembering working memory or remembering long-term memory, but it's about what he called kind of a slow process of building up experiences over large extents of time. And the instance that he gave is, for instance, a situation that you might, so to say, be with another friend, and then you can be away from each other for a week or a month or a year, and the moment you get together again, it is as if you can pick up from the place that you were previously and immediately continue the understanding of where you were previously. And we decided with Merlin to try to see, would we find any places of the brain that would be correlating with or indicative of such a situation. Now, for those of you who have done fMRI studies, you know that it's really difficult to work with long processes in a brain scanner because it's somehow set up in such a way that you can only work with blocks that are 20 to 30 seconds long, and then the scanner starts drifting, so you can't really study things that extend over a long time. But we tried to do a very simplified version of it, which was that we basically took from a popular Danish magazine the crime story of the week, and then we carved it up into similar bits and pieces. And then we put people inside a scanner and let them hear the beginning of the first of a story. And then they would hear a random part from another story. And then they would hear the second part of the story, and then a random part of another story, and then the third part of a story, and a random part, etc. over time here. So kind of mimicking that idea that you go into a space and there is a story that builds up, but it gets interrupted by something else, and you need to go back and then construct the narrative as it unfolds here. The first thing that we found was that when we tested people on what they remembered in these stories here, then inside of the coherent stories, so those stories that were building up over time, they got to realize who had killed the fat woman or who had killed the young man or whatever had happened. People were not very good at remembering the exact details in the story. So did he drive in a red car? What kind of trousers did he wear, etc. They were much better at remembering those details in those stories that didn't really lead to anything. They were not part of anything else. Whereas the more plot-related phenomenon, so that which had to do with understanding, you can say, the deeper structure of the narratives, the intentions, etc., became remembered much better in those things that develop into a plot as opposed to those that were just random bits here. And when we looked again more systematically at what was building up in the coherent stories as opposed to the incoherent stories, we found in particular an area here, something in the medial prefrontal cortex and also among the right superior temporal sulcus. Again, areas that some people would like to correlate with the default mode brain activity that seems to be activated under those circumstances here. So there seems to be an activity building up in those, you can call it again, classical social cognition areas, etc., as some kind of a plot basically extends over time. And the more people, the better they were at remembering the plot-related facts as opposed to the non-plot-related facts, the more activity you would also see in these particular regions. And that brings us, in a sense, back again to our friends in the cave in South Africa here, that maybe this ability here to, so to say, imagine yourself and construct a kind of a narrative that extends yourself 160,000 years back in time might precisely be tying into something that's a very typical finding, if what human life is about. And in a paper coming out soon with Tobias Starsack, a German philosopher, we are arguing that precisely what might be characterizing that particular way of being as cognitive beings in the world that humans are about is about our ability on one hand to shape each other's minds through interactions, and also our ability to be engaging with material stuff in ways that no other species seems to be doing. And precisely these things here, our ability to shape and interact with each other and our ability to build our worlds with each other, seems to be what allows us to expand as individuals beyond time and space in ways that support some very particular forms of collaboration and coordination. And that might lead both to intergroup diversity, temporally and spatially. Now, we started out this talk by saying that this was about interacting with the world here, but maybe the interaction isn't really the best way to talk about these instances here. Because maybe what seems to be going on in these situations of people doing stuff with each other isn't just a matter of, so to say, interacting as an agent, but really to be, as a person, engaging in a situation and engaging in others here. And together with Glenda Zadna, a philosopher from Argentine, we have been arguing that it's maybe not the interaction understood as the neutral ways that agents fall into patterns with each other that really does it. It's precisely by falling into these mutual patterns of relating to each other through a history that builds up over time that we really become the part of people that we are. And this way of thinking about research that I have been unfolding for you also, I believe, have some kind of implications for what it is like to study these particular phenomena that we will be exploring in the Bubbles conference here. I see myself primarily as an anthropologist, and there is a lot of funny things to say about anthropology. It's built on a not existing method, and it used to build on kind of very stereotyped ideas about what the world would be like. Here is a Gary Larson drawing of some natives on some island somewhere where the anthropologists are coming in, and all the natives are doing everything they can to look as little Western as possible, in order to appear as radical others in the eyes of the anthropologists, who more than anyone else have been part of creating that idea of there being us, typically Westerners, and there being the rest that are different from each other. And I think if there is anything positive that has come out of anthropology as a contribution to what it is like to think about studying people, then it really has to do with confronting, in a somewhat painful way, those strange ways in which we, so to say, create mental bubbles about what other people are like, and how you might have, as a research practice, a way to transcend this or move beyond it. And one of the researchers that has done this more than others is an American anthropologist, George Marcus, who, as a bit of a pun, has argued, and just let this thing here cast here, that what you should be doing if you do ethnographic research, what you should be doing, I think, as paradigmatic actually of all of the things that you were discussing here inside of the Bubbles kind of workshop, is to think very differently of what it is like to do research than this situation of the anthropologist or the biologist or the psychologist coming in order to look at people in the perspective of something that they have to redo themselves to match into that particular place. He says that what you should be thinking of are sites that are parasites or parasites. And those, he claims, are kind of places where ethnographers, but that could also be any other researcher, works at sites of knowledge productions with others who are patrons, partners, and subjects of research at the same time. These spaces, he says, can help to generate unexpected ways of speaking and thinking with people who are, as yourself, moderately empowered and who are implicated in great social transformations. So this type of research is really a type of research that tries to get away from seeing yourself as someone who studies other people that needs to be confined in particular ways, to say that actually knowledge about other people is something that has to develop in some kind of a dialogue with each other. And as you take this dialogue seriously, and you can do that in an experimental kind of way, you end up creating something that's both a story about yourself and a story about the others, and in the transformation changes how you might think about it. A little bit like the example of me going to China and meeting up with Shuhui and saying, well, I don't really trust your study, let's look at it differently, and we ended up creating a story that each of us are caught up within. The challenge for these things here is a challenge that I think a lot of us doing interdisciplinary research is facing, that in order to do these things, you have to fight with particular ways in which scientific disciplines understand each other. To some degree, you can liken scientific disciplines to something like ballroom dancing, where there are certain steps that are okay and certain steps that are not okay. This is a picture from the Australian film called Strictly Ballroom, which is precisely about a group of ballroom dancers that decides to say, well, can we dance the dances somewhat differently from the way that we have usually been doing it? And I think what we are facing in the current ways of discussing these things here is something that's akin to the Strictly Ballroom situation, namely, how on earth do you produce knowledge that at the same time live up to the rules and regulations that you need to follow in order to get published in the papers you want to be published in, while at the same time, so to say, changing the boundaries for what it is like to do research, what it is like to ask questions, what it is like to be reflective about the type of knowledge you do and how you do it. And I think something like the Bubbles initiative that you have here, the type of interactions, not just within researchers, but also between research and artists, might be one of the ways that we can, so to say, co-construct parasites that might take these discussions in novel directions. Thank you. Sure.
I just have a question regarding, you started off by showing the study by Kovalenka on synchronicity in heartbeat, that is interacting with the notion of the group, with someone who's closely related with the fireworker in white, showing the synchronicity and unrelated people not. And then you were talking about a more recent study beyond synchronicity, where you looked at the relationship between heart rate synchronization and outcomes of cooperation. If I understood correctly, you said that there are some instances where the synchronicity in the heart rate might be detrimental to some aspects of the object that's being created collectively or in terms of cooperation. And I see sort of a conflict there also true. Also, maybe taking one more study up, I think it was by Goldstein, looking at the relationship between pain, touch, and heartbeat synchronization. If I remember correctly, there were some results showing that if someone is in pain and you can soothe his pain with touch, you will also see a synchronization in heartbeat. So I wonder how we can explain those different results.
We have been trying to get our head around it at first, and you know, we thought initially that whenever we did these studies of people doing things together, falling in sync would correlate with anything good, right? And we just didn't find it. In a number of studies, we didn't find it. And we tried it again, we didn't find it. We couldn't get it published because all the reviewers said, you know, you should find synchronization, you don't find it. And I think one of the ways that we're currently looking at it is that part of the embodied aspect might be kind of an emotional way of being able to, kind of an emotional synchronization with each other. But what we tend to find in the more goal-oriented tasks is that perhaps in order to solve a goal-oriented task, then, you know, unless you are in a hierarchical relationship or unless you're uncertain about how you relate inside the group, you really want to be able to, so to say, space out in solution space. Right? And that part of the interaction is not us being in the same physiological space and in the same solution space, but actually being able to manage those differences that comes from being in those spaces. Mm-hmm. And we think that this is why we are increasingly seeing that if we are focusing on the task solving, and in particular maybe kind of an innovative task solving, then it seems not to be a good idea for the bodies to be in sync with each other, because that makes it difficult to actually do something novel and to harvest and use those differences that are in place. Whereas in other situations, if it's about creating social cohesion, like a ritual is very much about, or if you're in an uncertain situation where you don't know where the other person is going, then the kind of falling into sync might be what dominates it. And this is how we are currently trying to work with it and develop those ideas. And it's a more complex model than the idea that we're just in sync with each other. But it's, I think, also a more interesting one where you are, in a sense, also creating a space for people to be different to each other and to work constructively with those differences if certain boundary conditions are in place. Yes?
I have a question. What do you think about the fact that within all the goodwill that lies behind one's research, there is something that characterizes the work that you're describing, which makes me think of a bubble.
Yes.
In the sense that not being someone using neuroscience techniques nor anthropology methodologies, I wonder why it is important to you to say what is specific about the human. I mean, why is it important for you ethically or philosophically or morally to think that it's a good thing to say what makes us human as opposed to what makes us a bee or a moth or a particle in the universe or a robot? Because it reminds me, I mean, as a feminist, it reminds me of a very long history of anthropocentric thinking. That's the question.
That's the question.
So it's a very personal question.
Yes.
It's about what moves you to be inclusive up to a certain limit.
Yes. So I have another article which is all about how you might relate to trees and how you can, in a sense, get into other forms. So it's just to say that, yes, in this particular talk, the story became very much focused on the human and also on the particular aspects of the human. And it would...
That's the question.
Yeah, and there it's... Part of that is a strictly ballroom answer, I think. That in the sense that one of my ambitions as a researcher was to take issues of interaction and, so to say, front-load it into a body of knowledge that didn't see it a lot beforehand. But that might have come at the cost of, so to say, going into particular experimental paradigms where these other things could not be explored. I think this is the best answer I can give you there.
Okay.
Yeah?
Thanks for this talk. I have a question. So you mentioned it several times through the talk, the folklore network and the self. And I realized you were a bit reluctant to say there is a network of the self.
Yes.
Because there's one Thailand study
Yeah.
where people use when they see their own constructed Lego elements, they implement this network. There's another study on narrative. I'm asking because there is also a study done by Andreas and colleagues looking into art
Yes.
appreciation.
Yes.
And they also found that when you highly
Yes.
appreciate art,
Yes.
also there in the folklore
Yes. Yes.
big statement, there might be something,
Yes.
some processes related to the self,
Yes.
when we highly like
Yes.
art. I just wanted to hear what you think.
I mean, so this is, and it's kind of relating back to your story again, that there is another talk which could be about, well, what did we actually learn by going in via the brain, right? And I think the short version of that is it didn't give us a fundamentally different understanding of who we are as people, but it learned us a lot about the brain, where the notions of what brains are have been quite radically transformed over the last 20 years to be a brain that's open to the world and much more plastic than we thought about it hitherto. So, and I guess I would agree with that position. There's an interesting point in it that you can say it's almost that the scientific research has kind of, I wouldn't say deconstructed, but kind of radically transformed the idea about what his own subject matter was in the process. And that's interesting in itself. But I don't think it has given us a fundamentally different narratives of who we are. We end up with a different story of what brains are like. In a brain age, this is an important aspect. In a different time, it might not be important. Yeah.
Yeah, the questions are interesting. Let me just give a quick reaction to your question. I think we'd all agree that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a work of art.
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Okay, other than the lady there, other than the person there, most of us
It's
would
very
agree.
interesting to
I'm
say that.
going to come back to you, don't worry.
Okay, okay.
Other than the person there for the moment, we would agree that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a work of art. And when it's played in front of the Brandenburg Gate on the 25th anniversary of the falling wall or whatever, we would describe that situation, most of us, independent from our fMRI scans, as one heart, one mind. There's a unison there that people have come together, and in a number of ways, but clearly an emotional way. Whether it's a legitimate emotional response or not, leave that aside. But clearly there's been a unity there, which has emerged as a phenomenon in that work of art. I think that's important to reflect on. As to the ladies, or to the person's point, I think Nietzsche gave the best answer to that question as to why we sort of privilege ourselves over ants and moths, or grubs and ants, as Aristotle would have said, or did say. It's because humans would rather be void of a purpose, have the void for a purpose than be void of a purpose. And Nietzsche, of course, called that a disease. And Sartre will say condemned to freedom is sort of a disease. Some of us think it's a healthy moment, others think it's a disease, but I think that's the answer. But to go back to, could you go back several slides to the one where you're talking about monkeys and, or I don't know, chimpanzees or something.
Ladies.
Say what?
The slide with the ladies.
With the lady, just the one which is trying to measure the difference. The one that's trying to measure the difference, or talking about the possible differences between monkeys and the higher primates and ourselves. No, not that one. Not that one.
This one?
No, it was. Does anybody else remember the slide where it's what is it about humans that allows them to extend over longer time periods?
This one here, maybe?
No.
This one here. Oh yeah, but this is just quoting from. It's an old debate. This is quoting from Donald's claim, right?
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Okay. And I of course think that's true, and I think it's descriptive, and the explanation of that at a folk psychology level would be that when you talk about temporal integration, it's a mistake to focus just on memory. Time does not come in a single dimension. Time always comes in 3 dimensions: past, present, and future. And it turns out that the future The anticipation is what is most important about shaping the temporal space. And that is really systematically ignored, particularly in cognitive science. They'll talk about prediction at the brain level, the Lopesian, and that sort of thing. But they don't talk about anticipation, which is what drives our day-to-day experience, moment to moment. It's anticipation that stitches together our behavior and our interaction. And it's because chimpanzees or whatever, for whatever reason in their brain, can't not just remember, but can anticipate to the future as far as we can, that they don't put things together the way we do. So focus on the anticipation.
So I think the Bayesian brain people would say that the anticipation and the prediction are kind of closely related to each other, or might be two sides of the same coin. But I will not defend. I think where it becomes interesting would be, you can say, the role of something like narratives in precisely tying both into the past and into the present.
Exactly.
I think this is.
And that's why narratives are put together as a whole, and that's why the random things, they don't have a narrative for them, and that's why the individual parts stand out. But once you get into a narrative, you're not just into memory space, you're into anticipation space.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It only holds together because it's got both of those dimensions coming into the present.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. Yes. Other comments?
Yeah.
Yes, Simon?
Yeah, just wondering about this, about this sync problem, and then your answer about that, I just came to my mind this differentiation of self-other distinction as equally important as also sync, right?
Yeah.
And the relevance for that, from a brain perspective, of the brain actually doing that simultaneously, in a way, I mean, we need to know what our body is, and also what the other body is doing. So it seems that both processes can happen at the same time, but also are different processes.
Yeah, so in a sense, people are in the world. We hardly know if brains are in the world, but I think what people are constantly engaging in is this process of both falling in with each other and dissociating again. And we don't need neuroscience to tell us that, but it becomes maybe interesting to see what happens if that becomes a parameter that you're looking at.
And then next step is culturally. That also what happened here is that it's our own self need to be acknowledged. So we need to be recognized as a different thing,
yes,
right? By others, not only in sync, right? Not only similar. So
I think so. One of the things that Glenda and I have been trying to do in shifting from looking at interaction that's really just about falling into patterns into a question about engagement is it might allow you to emphasize on that aspects of both recognition and falling in and falling out with each other. And that would highlight the persons rather than the agents, but I think that would, for me, be a way to go. Yes, sorry, there's a question in the back.
Yeah, I'd actually like to know your opinion, because there is this one study about identity and self, and you were comparing it, or in the study they were comparing it with cultures of Danish and Chinese.
Yes.
How do you integrate that with localization and interculturalism? I mean, what do you think sort of an effect it would have on the perception of self for the future and how it's shifting now?
So, I mean, I guess I was trying to tell the story to say, well, I don't think that there are radical cultural differences in the world. So people who work in this field, I think where the interesting things are coming out has to do with how they are essentialized in different contexts. And there's been some work looking at people who have a bicultural background, whatever that means, and being able to see that it seems to be depending on the context they're in. You will see that the indicators or the correlate of the self in the brain, to the degree that that makes sense, that really shifts depending on the context. And I would take that story to be, you can say, a biological instantiation of what we know is a human story, that our way of being in the world relates very much to how we are with others and which kind of resources are to be drawn on. And that what might increasingly be happening is that a lot of us, in a sense, develop a flexible ability to be moving across these different contexts. But that also entails playing out different roles in those contexts. And that can be seen in the biology, but the biology wouldn't be driving it. That would be my take there. Cool. Thank you.